I want to live in Liverpool. The theme this time is a brief introduction to the Beatles' early, middle, and late periods. Beatles knowledge you might be too embarrassed to ask about now. New Beatles listeners, have you noticed that the Beatles are often discussed in terms of different periods? The middle period of the Beatles is the best. No, it's the late Beatles. In the end, you always come back to the early Beatles. You hear conversations like these everywhere. People talk assuming everyone knows what they mean. But for those who have just started listening to the Beatles, this might not make much sense. You could ask a nearby Beatles maniac, but many people might feel overwhelmed by their enthusiasm and love for the band. So today, I'll briefly introduce what generally defines the early, middle, and late periods. The Beatles were active for about 8 years, from 1962 to 1970. While there are various ways to divide this time, the most common is into early, middle, and late periods. Early period from Liverpool's Beatles to the world's Beatles. What's the basis for these time divisions? The answer is albums. The periods are defined by the style of their albums. The albums considered part of the early period are Please Please Me, with the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help. These albums symbolize youth. They're all very energetic. This period marks the Beatles' expansion from local Liverpool favorites to popular figures across Britain, Europe, the United States, and the world. The early Beatles albums are characterized by pop and cheerful sounds. But being pop and cheerful doesn't mean they're simplistic. What's remarkable about the early Beatles is how strongly they imprinted their pop, cheerful image and sound worldwide. When people say something sounds Beatles-esque, they're often referring to this period's sound. In that sense, the early Beatles sound has become a genre in itself. Middle period experimental sounds and psychedelic recording era. The middle period is when they began pursuing new sounds, using recording techniques. The albums considered part of the middle period are Rubber Soul, Revolver, SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Magical Mystery Tour, treating it as an album for simplicity. The turning point was their fifth album, Rubber Soul. This album doesn't have the strongly imprinted image of the early Beatles. The members themselves admit that during the production of this album, they became interested in recording techniques, which greatly expanded their musical expression in subsequent works. Late period Beatles return to roots and the emergence of a third songwriter. In the late 60s, at the height of the hippie movement, the Beatles abruptly abandoned their psychedelic sound after Magical Mystery Tour and aimed for a sound that could be called a return to their roots. This is the Beatles' late period. The albums considered part of the late period are The Beatles aka The White Album, Yellow Submarine, Let It Be, Abbey Road. From the masterpiece, The Beatles, where you can enjoy the musicality of John, Paul, George, and Ringo individually, to their last original album, Abbey Road. This is considered the Beatles' late period. Sound-wise, it's a return to roots, with each member doing what they want to do. The fact that they still produced great songs and albums is what makes the Beatles amazing. The most notable point of the late period is the rise of George Harrison. He rapidly improved his songwriting skills. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, Here Comes the Sun. Many people probably know these three songs. They still play nicely in stylish cafes even today. All three are George's late period works. This marks the emergence of the Beatles' third songwriter, on par with Lennon-McCartney. Despite the return to roots and the emergence of a third songwriter in the late period, the Beatles unfortunately disbanded after the production of Abbey Road. This roughly covers the late period. Conclusion: every period of the Beatles is attractive. I've briefly introduced the early, middle, and late periods of the Beatles. There might be opinions like, Help should be in the middle period, you idiot. But I'm introducing the general divisions here. Please try listening to the Beatles with these periods in mind. I've provided brief explanations about the original albums for reference. Which period you'll like depends on the individual and your mood at the time. That's all. A brief introduction to the Beatles' early, middle, and late periods. The end. Please subscribe to the channel.